The human brain is wired for pleasure and pain. Neurotransmitters carry such messages, and there is no shortage of ways to trigger them. Yes, with the old standards such as drugs and food, but now also with technological quick hits that can be just as addictive and destructive. Dr. Anna Lembke is a professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Her new book is called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, and she joins us tonight from Stanford, California. Dr. Lembke, it's great to have you on our program. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. I'm going to quote you back to you to get us started here, and then we'll dive in. Here's what you've written. We have transformed the world, you write, from a place of scarcity to a place of overwhelming abundance. Drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebooking, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting. The increased numbers, variety, and potency of highly rewarding stimuli today is staggering. The smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. If you haven't met your drug of choice yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. Well, that beautifully sets up what we're going to be talking about for the next 24 minutes or so. So let's start with a basic definition. What is dopamine?
Dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain. It's a neurotransmitter. So it's a molecule that allows our neurons to communicate. And a neuron is sort of the workhorse cell of the brain that creates the circuits that make our thoughts, emotions, consciousness, everything that we are. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is fundamental to the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It may be even more important for motivation than for reward. So, for example, there's a very famous experiment where rats were engineered to have no dopamine in the specific reward circuit in the brain. And what the scientists discovered is if they put food into the rat's mouth, it would eat the food and seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even a body length away, the rat would starve to death. In other words, the lack of dopamine made that rat not motivated to get up and go get the food that it needed to survive.
Now, these reward pathways, as it were of course established many, many thousands of years ago, and I wonder how mismatched they are to the world we live in today.
Yes, great question. So our brains have evolved over millions of years of evolution to have us approach pleasure and avoid pain. And dopamine is essentially the signal to approach, to explore, to investigate. It's the signal of a potential reward. But the problem is that we have spent most of human existence in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And we now live in a world of overwhelming abundance in which we have access to an almost infinite variety of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, and we're largely insulated from pain. And the result is that our brains are reeling in response to the fire hose of dopamine that we're getting from the moment we wake up and touch our phones and drink our caffeinated beverage and eat our, sugar donut, to the Netflix binging we do at night and everything in between.
So can we understand the world we live in today truly without understanding how dopamine works?
I don't think so. I think understanding this basic neuroscience of how we process pleasure and pain is really fundamental to understanding how our ancient wiring is mismatched for the modern ecosystem, and also, importantly, what we can do about it.
I feel a bit like Barbara Walters asking this next question, as you may remember she did of Katharine Hepburn once upon a time, when she said, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? I'm going to take a little variation on that by saying, if dopamine were a person in our lives, what would our relationship with that person be?
I think that would be a person that you would want to distrust somewhat. That would be a person who on occasion might be lying to you about what you should be doing. Because again, what happens is that our brains release dopamine when we ingest a substance or do a behavior that makes us feel good. And from the perspective of survival in a world of scarcity, that's great because that has us seeking out food, clothing, shelter, a mate. But in a world in which you've got TikTok and Facebook and cigarettes and potent cannabis, and it's all so available and so potent and so ubiquitous, we have to distrust those signals of pleasure. And really, we have to kind of create a world within a world in which we learn to restrain ourselves and abstain from too much pleasure. And believe it or not, actually seek out pain or seek out things that are challenging. And the reason for this is because the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And they work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we do something pleasurable, the balance tips to the side of pleasure and we release dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. But one of the overarching rules governing that balance is that it wants to go back to the level position, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way it does that is what's called the opponent process reaction. It first tilts an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect. I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But they really like it on the balance, those gremlins, so they don't get off when we're level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. Now, if we wait long enough before we grab another piece of chocolate or watch another Netflix episode, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But if we continue to ingest our drug repeatedly over days to weeks to months to years, what happens is we accumulate enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And now we're walking around in a chronic dopamine deficit state. We're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving or mental preoccupation with our drug. And now we need to use not to get high, but actually just to level the balance and feel normal. And this is really relevant for all of us, not just those who meet, diagnostic and statistical manual criteria for addiction, because we're all ingesting too many reinforcing drugs and behaviors in all these small myriad ways every day. And the result is that I believe we as individuals and as nations are ending up in this dopamine deficit state where we essentially are really unhappy. We don't know why. We feel guilty for being unhappy. In our unhappiness, we're culturally encouraged to reach for another pleasure. And yet doing that actually further tilts our balance to the side of pain in the long run. So again, the intervention is actually to abstain from our drug of choice, whatever it is, that thing that once we start, we have difficulty stopping. Do it for long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored and we can again take pleasure in more modest rewards, and we're not walking around in this dopamine deficit state.
I think anybody who has spent a late night with a tub of Haagen-Dazs can absolutely relate to what you just said. But let's put some numbers on this just to set up this next line of questioning, because you have said that based on studies with rats, chocolate increases dopamine above baseline by 50%, sex by about 100%, nicotine 150%, amphetamines 1,000%. Okay, these dopamine rushes do give us tremendous pleasure and tremendous reward, but also pain. Is the only prescription here, and I think you hinted at it at the end of that last answer, is the only prescription here abstention?
So the first step, again, is to determine what is our drug of choice, because it's going to be different for different people. The amount of dopamine elevation that you just quoted from that study is based on rats, but rats are different than humans, and humans are different from each other. So what might raise my dopamine level 50% above baseline may not raise your dopamine level, or you may go even higher. So we have to decide what is our drug of choice, that thing that I have this conflicted relationship around, to give that up for 30 days, because that's about the average amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways, to know that in those first 2 weeks, we're going to feel worse before we feel better, because our gremlins will all of a sudden, go to the side of pain and we'll be in withdrawal. But by the time they hop off, we'll go back down to a level balance. But the other thing is that the gremlins are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. So if we press on pleasure by ingesting an intoxicant, they will hop on the pain side. But if we initially press on the pain side, those neuroadaptation gremlins actually hop on the pleasure side. And with repeated use, we end up resetting our balance to the side of pleasure. So that's things like exercise in moderate doses, ice cold water baths, any kind of mind body activity. Intermittent fasting can serve that function. Things that are cognitively or psychologically challenging for us that generate anxiety. Because what happens when we press on the pain side of the balance is we essentially signal to our body that there has been an injury. And believe it or not, even exercise, which we know is really healthy, is injurious short term to cells. But the reason that exercise is healthy, like these other activities, is because our body gets the signal, oh, there's an injury. And then our own re-regulating, restoring mechanisms kick into action. We start to make more dopamine, more serotonin, more epinephrine, these other feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters. And so we get our dopamine by paying for them up front, which is a much healthier and enduring way to get that kind of pleasurable hit.
How do you know, though, when you have crossed the line from sort of moderately unhelpful, unconstructive, unhealthy behavior to out-and-out addiction?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, addiction is a spectrum disorder, right? So you can have mild, moderate, and severe forms. Some of the important things to look for are the 4 C's. So control, compulsion, craving, and consequences. Out of control use means I said I would ingest a certain amount and I ingested more, and I do that on a regular basis. Compulsion means a lot of my mental real estate occupied with the drug, getting the drug, using the drug, a kind of narrowing of my focus and energy and creativity on the drug, as well as initiating the drug with some automaticity, even when I wasn't thinking about it. So a compulsive automatic use. Craving is mental preoccupation and also suddenly overwhelming wanting the drug. And then consequences, is sort of the sine qua non of addiction, the compulsive continued use despite harm to self and or others. Those are the criteria, along with tolerance, needing more and more over time to get the same effect. And with digital drugs, that can take the form of, for example, finding that you need more and more graphic, vivid video games, or you need more deviant forms of pornography, or you just need more in quantity in order to kind of get your dopamine. Why? Because you've got those gremlins accumulating on the pain side of the balance. More sort of, these aren't in the DSM, but things that I see based on my patient experience is that when we start to lie about what we're consuming and how we're spending our time, that's a really strong red flag for the possibility that we have become addicted or at least entered this realm of compulsive overconsumption. And also when we lose joy in other activities that used to give us pleasure, that means that our motivation and reward system has potentially been hijacked by this intoxicant.
I should ask you about, I love that expression, your mental real estate, because my mental real estate can certainly determine when my kids have been on their smartphones too long and they look like they're addicted to it. But I have to say, in all candor, I don't necessarily know when that's the case for me. So can you help me with that one?
Yeah, such a great point. So when we're chasing dopamine, we often lose the ability to see true cause and effect, especially in ourselves, right? So it can be a very insidious, slippery slope where in the moment, all we know is that it feels good, but we lose track of time. So we become less aware of the amount of time and energy we're investing in it. And especially we lose the ability to see the way that it's harming us, especially those subtle harms, like the way it's impacting our mood, the way it's impacting our sleep, the way it may be impacting in subtle ways our interpersonal relationships and our ability to really be there and be present. And digital devices, I think, are especially insidious because when we're using our device, we essentially disappear for the people around us. But we don't see that because we're, very, very engaged and drawn to this screen, which is why this dopamine fast or this 30 days of abstinence from our drug of choice can be so instructive, even if we don't self-identify as addicted. First of all, sometimes we discover we really are addicted when we see how hard it is to stop. But also stopping can just be a really good way to kind of push the reset button and to get more insight on how our drug use is impacting our lives. And again, when I use that word drug, I'm using it very broadly, not just for traditional drugs that we ingest, but also all of these amazing modern digital drugs that we're all getting so hooked on.
There's something sort of understandable about that 30-day time period that you've recommended here, because people can sort of say to themselves, all right, for July, I'm going off technology, or for July, I'm not having any alcohol, or for July, I'm not doing any ice cream, whatever it is. But is there something actually rooted in science that says 30 days is the time that you need?
Yeah, so there's a seminal study done by Brown and Schuckett, where they took a cohort of adult males who were addicted to alcohol and who also met clinical criteria for a major depressive episode, so for a clinical depression. They took those individuals and they put them in a hospital, but they didn't give them any treatment for depression. All they did was remove their access to alcohol. And after 30 days, 80% of those individuals no longer met criteria for major depression. In other words, just removing the alcohol essentially cured their major depressive episode. That's really, really important, because what that tells us is that substances are the great mimic, and they really can drive these psychiatric symptoms. Although in the moment, those people would have said, like so many of my patients will say, well, using this substance is actually self-medicating my psychiatric problem. But that's because they don't appreciate the ways in which at first using that substance might have relieved anxiety, depression, insomnia. But over time, because of neuroadaptation and accumulation of those gremlins on the pain side, essentially what happens is they make that psychiatric symptom worse. So that's really important. And that 30-day trial with men with alcohol use disorder, abstaining for a month and being relieved of their depression is a very good indicator that it does take about a month to reset those dopamine reward pathways. I've been practicing psychiatry for almost 30 years. I do that as a primary clinical intervention in many of my patients, abstaining from pornography and masturbation for a month, abstaining from video games for a month, abstaining from cannabis for a month, whatever it is. And I have had a similar kind of a statistic where about 80% of folks will come back after that month with no other intervention and feel much, much better with significant improvement in their psychiatric symptoms. Now, importantly, 20% won't, right? So that's also really good data, because that tells me, okay, well, the substance or the kind of compulsive overconsumption that they're doing isn't the main driver of their psychiatric symptom. Or often it'll be a combination. So they'll come back and they'll feel better, but they still won't feel entirely well. I will also say that 30 days, in my experience, is sort of like the bare minimum to kind of begin to reset reward pathways for people with severe addiction. Really getting back to that baseline homeostatic dopamine firing level probably takes on the order of 3 to 6 months, or in some cases, even out to 18, 24 months. So it kind of depends on the person. There's also some interesting neuroimaging studies showing that 2 weeks is not sufficient. So there's a very famous study by Nora Volkoff, the head of National Institute of Drug Abuse, showing that if you take people who have been using a myriad substances in an addictive way and you image their brains 2 weeks after they stop, what you find is they have decreased or abnormally low dopamine transmission in the nucleus accumbens, which is this reward circuit. And that's also consistent with my clinical experience. I'll have patients who will abstain for 2 weeks and they say, I still feel terrible. I was like, yeah, that's because you're still in withdrawal, right? You've still got gremlins on the pain side of your balance. But if you can just hang in there and make it to week 3 or week 4, they'll start to hop off. You'll reassert homeostasis and you'll feel better.
I wonder, though, if there are some patients for whom abstinence just is a bridge too far and they have to taper as opposed to just completely go cold turkey. Is that the case for some?
Yeah, absolutely right. And thank you for raising that. So this is not an intervention I would recommend for someone who's repeatedly tried to stop and was just unable to do it. That individual needs a higher level of care. Maybe they need to go to a residential treatment facility. I would also not recommend this for somebody who's on a substance for which abruptly stopping would give them life-threatening withdrawal. That includes prescription benzodiazepines or even benzodiazepines obtained in other ways. Benzodiazepines are a class of sedatives that include things like Xanax, Valium, Ativan. So for those individuals, you want to taper down slowly because the withdrawal from those substances can be life-threatening. Likewise with alcohol. So many people can stop alcohol right away, but some people are at risk for life-threatening withdrawal. Also, opioids can be very painful withdrawal and in some rare instances life-threatening. So for those individuals, I recommend that you seek the help of a medical professional and get their advice on whether you can stop abruptly or whether you really need to taper down slowly over time.
I don't mean to get all religious on you in asking this next question, but Buddhism has long seen desire and craving as sources of our own suffering, and I wonder whether you think Buddhism, in some sense, is a way to try to keep dopamine in check.
Yeah, Buddhism talks about walking the middle path, right? Not clinging to pleasure and also not clinging to pain, because we actually can, in extreme forms, get addicted to pain as well. But rather walking this middle path between the two. But Buddha lived over 2,000 years ago. The world was very different then. We now live in a world of shocking overabundance where almost every human behavior has been drugified in some way. So even healthy and adaptive sources of dopamine, like making human intimate connections, which releases dopamine through oxytocin in the reward pathway, has become drugified through things like social media, which means that the wisdom of the Buddha still applies, but it needs a footnote or an addendum, which is to say we actually need to veer slightly off the middle way and a little bit toward pain, because we're so inundated with pleasure and so insulated from pain that I think we really need a new form of asceticism. We need to seek out things that are hard. We need to intentionally make things less convenient. And we need to do that not only for ourselves, but also to save our planet. Our compulsive overconsumption, which is really the dark side of capitalism, is not just leading to our own demise, but it's also leading to the demise of this beautiful planet that we live on.
Well, let me get you to react to something that a previous guest on this program, Paul Bloom, the psychologist, who had a book called The Sweet Spot. I see you nodding. I guess you know Paul.
Yeah.
Here's 30 seconds of what he recently had to say about this on our program. Then we'll come back and chat in our last minute or so. Sheldon, if you would.
Nobody says, I'm going to run a marathon. I hope I get blisters. I'm going to run a marathon. I hope I give up halfway through. Nobody who chooses to have kids says, I hope for sleepless nights and anxiety and arguments with my partner and everything like that. But if it didn't have those as part of it, it wouldn't carry any weight. I sometimes think we're not sufficiently reflective about what we ourselves like. I think people often think, I just like to have a good time. That's all that has value to me. And then if you do a deep dive into your life, or you look at the research into people who've had good lives, you find that the sort of suffering lies there as a sort of hidden component, the secret sauce that makes things better.
The secret sauce. You want to react to that?
Oh, I love that. That's great. So it's a really important point about how we find meaning and purpose. And also, I would say how we find joy, because the point is that, pain is really important and it informs our lives. And it's also how we were evolved over millions of years to be in the world. We were evolved for pain. We were meant to suffer. We are good at that. We are natural strivers. And what's happened is that not only have we created this world, this modern world, through technology and innovation, all these great things, but we're insulated from pain. We're constantly bombarded with pleasure. And as a result, we are sick. We are physiologically unwell, because that's not what we were meant for. We were meant for friction. We were meant for challenge. And I believe we're actually happiest walking uphill.
I presume we have only whetted the appetite for our viewers and listeners to learn more about this, in which case they should read Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Anna Lemke, it's been a great pleasure having you on our program tonight. Thanks for joining us from Stanford, California.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.